Good day, LML4807 student. I'm Michelle Kukamur and I will be hosting your 5th online lecture, and we are looking at lesson 3, and we're going to divide this lesson into 2 parts. Today we will only deal with part 1 and our discussion will relate to the South African Reserve Bank. Now, a general overview of today's lecture. As we start all our other lectures, we start off by informing you of the outcomes that you need to achieve after you have finished this lesson. Firstly, we're going to explain to you how the Central Bank of South Africa, namely the Reserve Bank, was established. We also then touch on the influence of the provisions of the Constitution on the mandate of the Reserve Bank. Thereafter, you're going to have to write a short note on the powers and then the duties of the Reserve Bank. We'll also require you to expand on the functions of the Reserve Bank as the Central Bank of South Africa. Then, forming part of the lecture for next week, we'll explain the operation of the Banks Act, and we'll also look at the importance of the definition of deposit and the business of a bank in terms of the Banks Act. For this week, you will have noticed in your tutorial letter 101 that there's no additional material that you need to consult. You can only study then what is in your study guide. We are lucky in South Africa to have a well-regulated banking system, and you can be comfortable in knowing that our regulatory system complies with international best practice. Most of the stability of our banking system can be attributed to the fact that we have a central bank, namely the South African Reserve Bank, which can function independently and also according to a sound regulatory structure. If I may use the term that the South African Reserve Bank sits at the top of the South African banking system. You might have been introduced to the statement that we have different types of banks in the South African banking sector. As you will then think to yourself, different types of legislation would regulate each type. The different types of banks we talk about can briefly be divided into 3 categories. Firstly, I refer to this loosely as commercial banks. That's your Absa and your Nedbank and FNB and Capitec. And those banks are regulated mostly by the Banks Act, how they operate. Now obviously we are going to touch on other pieces of legislation that influence those banks, but predominantly the functioning of commercial banks would be regulated by your Banks Act. Mutual banks might be a concept that you're not that familiar with, but it's mostly a deposit-taking institution, and a good example you might have heard in popular press would have been VBS, when we talked about the VBS scandal which took place. Then we have cooperative banks, which would be regulated by the Cooperative Banks Act. And cooperative banks is usually recognized by being owned and operated by its members. Now, for your discussion further in your module, this is all you need to know about mutual banks and cooperative banks. But obviously, we are going to expand on some of the provisions of the Banks Act relating to what I loosely refer to as commercial banks or traditional banks. Now, the first part of today's discussion is going to talk to the South African Reserve Bank. You would have noticed already on the first page of this presentation that I included the emblem that the Reserve Bank is using for this year, and specifically that they are celebrating their centenary. So the Reserve Bank's been around for 100 years in June. Now, in our talk about the Reserve Bank, I'm going to touch on 5 aspects. The first one relates to the establishment of the Reserve Bank. Then I'm briefly referring to the impact of the Constitution on the Reserve Bank's operation. I will talk to the powers and related duties of the SARB. Then I move on and briefly mention some of the functions of the Reserve Bank. And I conclude by providing you with the departmental structure of the Reserve Bank. Now you'll see on the slide in front of you that I've provided you with a link. Please go and visit this link and familiarize yourself with the content of the website of the South African Reserve Bank. Now I've already mentioned to you that the bank will be 100 years old. So it will celebrate its centenary on the 30th of June. The South African Reserve Bank is regulated by the South African Reserve Bank Act 29 of 1966. Obviously, as I've already mentioned, the bank's been around for almost 100 years, so you would have gathered then for yourself. There's been legislation before the most recent statute regulating the South African Reserve Bank. Now, the South African Reserve Bank is regarded as a juristic person, and it's got a share capital amounting to 2 million rand, divided into specific or 2 million shares of 1 rand each. Now, in your study guide, you can go and do a bit more reading, because you would read from your prescribed paragraphs that there's certain restrictions related to the shareholding and also the voting rights attached to the specific shares. But I leave this up to you to go and do a bit more of a detailed analysis. The Constitution has a very specific impact on the protection of the independence of the Reserve Bank, but also then on the operation of the Reserve Bank. The first section we refer to is section 223, where it is confirmed that the South African Reserve Bank is the central bank of South Africa. And section 224 subsection 1 states what the primary objective of the Reserve Bank would be, namely that it's there to protect the internal and external value of the currency, which is the South African rand, in the interest of a balanced economic growth for South Africa. For example, think to yourself whether you might have heard measures which the SARB introduced when COVID hit South Africa. Go and see if you can find something in popular press. Then the last section of the Constitution related to the Reserve Bank is section 225. And here it basically states that the SARB must exercise those powers and functions that would normally be required from a central bank. Remember, we already said in section 223, the SARB is confirmed as the central bank of South Africa. And here we have specifically stating what the powers and functions of the SARB as the central bank should be. And section 225 goes further by saying that there needs to be specific legislation that would prescribe these powers and functions. And you already know we have the South African Reserve Bank Act. Can you see how the Constitution has an influence on the mandate of the South African Reserve Bank in this instance? Now, when we talk about the SARB, you know that we have an organization here that's established and functions by an enabling statute. So what we're basically saying is that the SARB can do what the SARB Act tells it to do. It cannot act outside of that mandate contained. It cannot act outside of a mandate if it is not specifically contained in your SARB Act. Now, there are 7 special powers of the SARB, and it's discussed in section 10 subsection 1 of the SARB Act, which the South African Reserve Bank would be able to do. Importantly, the SARB can issue and destroy banknotes and coins. In this instance, we mention that the SARB then obviously is responsible for issuing legal tender, because banknotes and coins would be regarded as legal tender in South Africa. Then obviously the SARS would be responsible to establish, organize and take part in a clearing system. This is where in a later lesson we're going to introduce you to the national payment system. Think to yourself, if you, for example, bank with ABSA and you transfer money to your sibling who banks with Standard Bank, how do they in the end, or at the end of the day, balance the two amounts from the banks? There must be a clearing system which is central somewhere. That's where the South African Reserve Bank comes in. Then the Reserve Bank can accept money on deposit, pay interest on any deposit or part thereof, and collect money from any person. It is a government bank in the sense that it grants loans and advances to government. And it's also got the power to buy, sell, discount or rediscount bills of exchange or promissory notes issued or drawn for commercial, industrial or agricultural purposes. And finally, it also manages the gold and foreign reserves of the country. I am not going to include the exclusions, so obviously the powers that the SARS don't have, which is listed in section 13. It doesn't mean it's less important. I just want to leave something for you to also go and do a bit of self-study on. So please have a look at the section in your study guide dealing with the specific exclusions, so meaning that those powers which the SARB do not have and cannot exercise. Now obviously, linked to the powers that the SARS would have would be the functions. You would be introduced to section 14 of the SARB Act, which again mentions that the SARB can issue notes, which would be regarded as legal tender within South Africa. It's the government's banker because it's the banker, agent and advisor to the government. Also, it is a custodian of banks' cash reserves. Now, you might have read somewhere that most banks must have on reserve a specific amount of the South African Reserve Bank. Have you ever thought of why banks actually have such a large drive to collect deposits from you, the public? Obviously, they must have certain amount of cash in reserve, and that amount would then be kept with the South African Reserve Bank. I've already mentioned to you that the Reserve Bank would be a central clearing bank. Then the bank of risk, the rediscount and lender of last resort to banks. Have you ever wondered what would happen if one of your banks go under? Obviously, the South African Reserve Bank would have the power to lend money to that specific bank if that is in line with the policy they want to achieve and whether it's sound monetary policy. The South African Reserve Bank is still a custodian of the country's gold reserves and foreign exchange reserves. And an interesting note, it's no longer the case, but in the old days, for every rand issued, there must have been the equivalent in gold held by the South African Reserve Bank. Now obviously, that requirement's no longer in place, but that's just a bit of an historic fact that I want to note to you. And then lastly, probably an aspect that would influence you as a homeowner or even a person that's got a credit card. The Reserve Bank would be the controller of money and credit. Have you ever read in the popular press that on a Thursday or certain Thursdays, the press would say, we are waiting for the Reserve Bank governor to make an announcement on the repo rate. Now the repo rate would be the rate against which the Reserve Bank lend money to commercial banks. And then the interest rate would then be the rate that banks collectively decide to lend money to their clients. So obviously you would have seen during COVID, we had a lot of instances where the Reserve Bank dropped the repo rate to enhance economic growth or stimulate economic growth. This is one aspect where you can actually see how banking law or banking and what you are learning is directly impacting on your daily life. Just on a side note, it has been said that the current interest rate is probably the lowest that it's been in 40 years. Now, when we wrote your study guide, I said that there were 15 departments of the South African Reserve Bank. When preparing for this presentation, I went to check again, and according to the SARB website, I have listed the departments there for you currently operating within the SARB. There you will see that I've made mention of the national payment system, which is going to be a lesson that you're going to be taught on later. And then also the Prudential Authority is one of the peaks in the Twin Peaks model of financial regulation. You would have heard about somewhere in the popular press as well. We will touch again on the Twin Peaks model of financial regulation in your concluding lesson for this module. Now, we've covered the most important aspects of the Reserve Bank. We move on to legislation that would apply to banks. Think back. In some of the previous lectures, I told you that you have a narrow definition of banking law or a wider definition. When I talk about narrow, I meant legislation that would directly impact on banks. And then when I said wider, I would say different laws which would influence how banks would operate. Remember the example I gave you where I said, what if you had a client that passed away and there was now a deceased estate happening? Obviously then, the principles of law of succession would apply in this instance. So this would be an example where you would have a wider definition of banking law. When I talk about legislation directly then applicable to banks, the most important statute is obviously the Banks Act 94 of 1990. Now, when I talk about a 1990 Act, just keep in mind that these pieces of legislation gets amended frequently. So just a tip or a side note for you as a law student, always remember to go and read the most recent version of a specific act, because obviously acts will be amended by other acts. For example, your Banks Act was amended by the Financial Sector Regulation Act when the Twin Peaks model of regulation came into operation. To the Banks Act, you will also get informed about regulations or regulations to the Banks Act in the next lecture that we will present next week. But just be aware that an act would function considering the main provisions of the act, but then you would also have instances where an act allows a person or an entity to pass regulations with reference to that enabling act. So just remember that fact at the back of your head so that you know what we're talking about when we get to the discussion next week. When we designed this specific module, we kept in mind that there would be legislation that would be applicable to banks. The first instrument would be the National Payment System Act, and that we discuss again in Lesson 8. The National Credit Act, obviously quite an important piece of legislation. We will again discuss in Lesson 10 when we talk about credit agreements. we've excluded the Consumer Protection Act from the discussion of this module. Then the Financial Advisory and Intermediary Services Act is not discussed in this module because it relates to a very specific type of financial product. But just keep in mind also that this specific act, also sometimes referred to as the FASE Act, was amended by the Financial Sector Regulation Act. Then we will discuss two specific types of legislation that deals with money laundering, firstly being the Prevention of Organised Crimes Act, and secondly, and probably more focused on, would be your Financial Intelligence Centre Act, or referred to as FICA. We will then conclude by giving you a very broad discussion of the Financial Sector Regulation Act in Lesson 12, which Act introduced the Twin Peaks model of financial regulation into the financial sector of South Africa. So, in summary, specific pieces of legislation that would be applicable to banks, most of which we discuss in lessons to follow. This was our lecture for today. As always, when we conclude, we provide you with our details and we invite you to contact us if you have any questions about today's lecture. All of the best with your studying, and see this week whether you are able to find anything in the popular press, in a newspaper article, for example, or on the internet regarding the functions of the Reserve Bank. An interesting topic during this time of COVID would actually be to go and see whether there were specific financial policies or regulatory policies the Reserve Bank implemented due to the impacts of COVID-19 on the South African economy. Let us know what you find. In the end, banking law must be your banking law. So see whether you can find examples of how we are continuously using these principles in the times that we live in. Enjoy your studying this week.